Counts the loss of very excellent people before it happens. If you're going to, I mean, a lot of very excellent people that are going to be very mobile. They're going to have a lot of confidence in themselves. And if you don't have the right things happening consistently within your organization, you're going to lose them. They're going to lose you because you're not going to be satisfied and think that your future, you don't want to tie your future up with this company and you want to go elsewhere. The more mobile, the more excellent people are, the more mobile they are, okay? And so you need to keep that in mind as you go through the understanding of these systems, okay? We mentioned that a grievance should be some violation, and I should say, you know, this last one, not just law, of course, law, the agreement itself, if there is a contractual agreement, maybe it's an employee agreement, company rules, past practice that sets precedents for how we expect people to behave, and of course, company responsibility, performance. Okay, versus a gripe. You know, I just don't like it. Okay? Okay, so many of you are going to be a manager, and in the chain, this procedure is very important to employees. And it's very important to remember the people aspect. This is not a mechanical system that we're evaluating here. This is a live, breathing person that is full of pride and full of expectations and hopes and desires and supports of family and other loved ones and so forth. Okay, so we're talking real people here. Okay, handling grievances in construction. Okay, often we have the employee who comes to someone, it's a supervisor, if you will, that he may say, okay, you know, this isn't right. I need to have something be done differently here. Okay, if it's a person who is in a union, they're going to go to the steward, and on up to, if they don't get redress that they feel satisfied with from the steward, they're going to elevate it to the next level of management, as should be possible by the employee. If the supervisor is not behaving well, and we find that happens more frequently than we'd like to admit, then we need to be able to go to the project manager or some senior executive to get redress, to get the thing fixed. Okay? If that isn't open, if their doors aren't open, if you don't know them, if you don't have any trust in them, you're just going to leave and go to somewhere where the pastors are agreeing with you. And they will lose excellent employees. Okay? Now, in the event that none of these can satisfy the problem, often in employee agreements, at least in very large companies, who've given considerable thought to this, and in agreements that are made by a union, there is a provision that if you can't get redressed, resolve the issues, then it will be resolved by binding arbitration through an arbitrator. We want to elaborate more on that process and what is to be expected there. Okay. So often arbitration is distinguished as binding arbitration. And these are legal terms by contract versus mediation. What do you suppose mediation is? What's the difference between binding arbitration and mediation? Yeah?
Mediation you don't have to do if you choose not to.
Okay, very good. That's the difference. Okay, good test answer. Okay? In fact, the mediator is sometimes hired not as a decision maker, but as a medium or process through which the mediator tries to achieve agreement between the parties where they weren't able to agree between themselves. Okay? But there is no legal obligation for either party to accept the recommendations of the mediator. Okay, so if you get an arbitrator, if it is, and it almost always is binding arbitration, You agree in advance that whatever this individual decides, both parties will be held responsible to do. And barring any legal aspects that have been violated, force, coercion, perhaps something like that, where the rights of the individual or the company have been violated, the courts have chosen historically not to overturn arbitration decisions. So effectively, you can't go and sue. You can try to sue, but it will not work to get something overturned that is decided under an agreement to do binding arbitration by the parties. So it effectively becomes the solution. Whether it works for you or not, that's the decision that you have to live with. Is that clear? Okay, so this is a process by which an answer is provided. And it's usually a neutral party in disputes. It's a quasi-legal procedure where the arbitrator acts as a judge, but has no legal power other than to decide this case. Okay? So he's not an elected judge, okay? Which means we gave him that authority by virtue of having elected him to the position. Okay? The courts do not alter arbitrator decisions. Exceptions are very rare and subject to violation of law by the arbitrator or by other parties to the process. And mostly those exceptions are in the process itself that they went through, and the arbitrators are expected to follow the law. Okay, so about 99% of all labor agreements provide for arbitration of grievances. This is a good thing, okay? We can't get it done ourselves, then at least we can get a decision rendered and move on, okay? And, for example, avoid a strike, right? Okay, so types of arbitrators. There's a final versus an advisory, binding versus non-binding, voluntary or compulsory, combinations of these. The vast majority are binding arbitration, okay? We don't want to turn an arbitrator into a mediator, okay, where he renders an opinion and you can take it or leave it. That's a lot of expense for not much benefit. Okay, if you're going to get a mediator, define it as such and get the mediator to come in and try to resolve the situation. Okay? There is value in that. Oftentimes it can be resolved where the parties are not able to come to resolution themselves. Okay, mediation is often less time consuming and less expensive than arbitration, and hopefully the mediator is able to help the agreement be worked out between the parties. Sometimes, in fact, oftentimes, the contract will call for both mediation, and if it can't be resolved by a mediator, then it is put over to binding arbitration. Okay? And in that arbitration, the arbitrator actually decides. Okay. Arbitration is intended to be quick and inexpensive, much more inexpensive, if you will, than a lawsuit, for example, okay, which is why we do it. But the reality is that the grievance process can often be very time-consuming and expensive. And in the absence of fraud or coercion, the arbitrator decisions are virtually impossible to overturn. You can attempt it through subsequent court proceedings. So what the management does when they sign an agreement that grievances will be managed through an arbitrator, well, we should ask, what causes them? Why would we want to decide to do it, put in our contract, that if we can't decide, we're going to turn it over to an arbitrator to decide? What's the benefit of that? Would you want to do that? What's the alternative? alternatives? Do things get resolved by themselves? No, they don't. Okay, so people are not going to be happy, right? You can't go on. Okay, so you can get it settled quick. Isn't that a viable benefit to go through this? Yeah.
Are arbitrators normally lawyers or just random people?
They're not random people, and often they
Do you
are.
specialize in being an arbitrator?
Excuse me?
Do you like specialize? Is that
You
like
can,
job
and
title?
many do. Many of them are college professors. Often they are very experienced people in the industry, consultants, okay? They need to understand the legal process itself, understand the law. They also need to understand the industry and how the industry works, okay? So that they can look at the very specific issues associated with what this particular group agreed they would do, and then look at the four corners of that contract and say, okay, now you show me evidence of what actually happened. Compare it against went on in the contract, so they got to be able to read the contract, right? And understand how that would be implemented by reasonably prudent people. And then compare the evidence for what actually happened with what they said was going to happen. And remember, this is not to come up with a solution that is the best solution. Okay? This is to render a decision relative to a contract. Remember, a grievance is something that we say, you said you would do this in our contract documents, that this would happen. This is what happened. And there's a gap there. Okay? So the arbitrator's job is to not go back and say, you know, you guys are so stupid, you shouldn't have said you were going to do that. No. That's not the issue. The point is, you said you would do it and you haven't done it. Okay? So it's to look back at the issue and say, what happened relative to what you said would happen? And that's what the arbitrator renders a decision on. Does that make sense? So the alternative is it doesn't get resolved. The people go away. They go away in a strike, okay? Or maybe they go away because they're locked out, or maybe they just leave and go to a different circumstance or job, okay? Contractor pulls off the job, right? We often find arbitration clauses in the contract for the client. Okay, you have to continue working. We don't want you to pull off the job. That's very expensive to go get another contractor. Well, you got a dispute with us over a change order or over something. Okay, we'll turn it over to arbitration if we don't get the thing resolved ourselves, and then we can go on and continue the contract. Okay, but we get it resolved, and we get it resolved quick. Does that make sense? Okay. So a no strike pledge, for example, in collective bargaining, if it exists, is legally binding. We talked about that in terms of the Boeing contract, right? Okay, they wanted a no strike clause in their contract, and they couldn't get the agreement for that. But if they do, it becomes legally binding, that it requires the union not to strike, and normally requires union management to accept a neutral, binding arbitration decision. Some pledges, the way that they state them, the words they use, make a difference. Okay? Those words can make it conditional, permit a strike under certain instances or circumstances, and not under others. That makes sense? Okay, so people can decide what they want to do, as long as they write a contract that isn't illegal, doesn't say I'm going to do something that is not legal to do. They can decide what they're going to do, and then they can expect to hold each other to that contract through this mechanism. Okay, there's often a notification process that, hey, we didn't get this thing resolved ourselves, someone or other, one of the two parties, sometimes three parties, decide we have to go to arbitration because we haven't resolved this thing. Okay? And so that notification is given. At which time both parties choose an arbitrator. Most commonly that arbitrator is chosen from a panel offered by the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service or the American Arbitration Association. And most arbitrators are lawyers or college professors or some other individual who is very knowledgeable about the industry, okay, that both have confidence in. Sometimes the provision will be that both of the parties choose an arbitrator, and now you got two arbitrators. Which one are you going to use? Well, now you say those arbitrators will select a third party, okay, and that will be the arbitrator. Okay? You got people that are fighting to be able to resolve it down to something they're going to actually do, right? So, okay, you pick somebody, I'll pick somebody, they'll make the decision because we can't do it. Okay? Okay, some of the subjects. Often it's about compensation. It's about wages, incentives, earnings, benefits, that sort of thing, and setting those levels. Again, usually the arguments brought to the table are market issues. Okay? What should we be paying our people, right? They may be based on theories of wage compensation. Hey, the consumer price index has gone up so much, or this kind of thing happened, we got to have an adjustment to the level of pay that's going on here. Okay? Okay, so if you've got to come up with some market information, you can't sit in your office and pull that out of the air, right? You got to have something that's defendable. Where are you going to get it? Okay? Well, one good place to go is to a monster link that's shown here. Okay? And there's some comparisons that are provided there. Okay? There are lots of companies that make it their job to go out and do market surveys of wages. Okay? That information is used by both union and non-union folks. They want to know what is the competition paying for this kind of job. Okay? It's also very common for executives to meet in a conference somewhere and talk about it. Okay? Or to call up your colleague and say, hey, what do you pay for engineers, you know, that do this kind of stuff? And they talk to each other. Okay? So, the challenge that we have in using any form of information to develop this is the variances, the occupational differences. Okay, well, where was the guy working? Okay, well, you know, how long was the job? Or, you know, there's a whole host of variances that could cause, you know, it to be worth a little more to pay people, or maybe quite a bit more to pay people. This guy had to go to Nigeria. That's not a safe place to go. And so we're paying $1,000 a day for the guys out there. Okay? So some differences there. Industrial differences. Again, if you look at engineers designing steel beams or something like that in the building industry, and you look at them in the industrial sector, there can be a variance between them. Okay? You might get paid more in the industrial sector than you do for the same skill set being used in a different industry. Residential, for example. Okay, there may be demographic differences. We've talked about that. Some of the things that were kind of appalling to me is that when I've done international work, oftentimes you look at people that are from America for the same skill set, and they're paid more, like 20% more than if you came from Britain or Australia, for example. You look at that and you say, that's interesting. If you're an American, you get paid 20% more? How about if you're a Bangladeshi and you're still trained and you can do the same job? Oh, well, that's about half, maybe 30% of what an American would be paid. for the same blooming job, on the same blooming project. Okay? So there are some kinds of differences like that that you may find appalling, as I did. Okay? But they are real. Differences resulting from union representation. We've talked about that in the past. Okay, so other factors, comparability among the wage rates themselves, the ability of the employers to pay. Of course, if you put the employer out of business, maybe they can go to work for the next employer that shows up on the job site, I don't know. But that can be an issue. The productivity of the employees, wow. That should make a difference, right? So how do we build that into the process? Changing, and that's a whole discussion that we do a whole course on that. Correct you, but changes in the cost of living, the specific employees' training. Okay, so you look at some typical hourly earnings in major sectors of the economy. We see construction generally is about 30% higher, 33% higher than it would be, say, in the services industry. Okay, a lot of that has to do with the instability of the construction industry. To attract workers, we have ended up being where we have over the years been required to pay premiums for that. Mining, this is a safety issue. Okay, manufacturing, again, more stable than construction, transportation, and so forth. Okay, retail trade way down there. Okay, so there are a lot of differences in these industries. Okay, this is really old data. Anyway, typically there is some difference between the union and the non-union rates that are paid. Okay. The influences, some of the influences that affect the wage decision include the individual rates versus the setting of group rates. Now, this is a tough thing to do. This is something that is, when we hit the last recession that we went into, what we saw happening in many industries is that they would go back, and we're no exception, and they would lay off. In fact, Lilly just announced, 2 weeks ago, that they were going to lay off over 1,000 workers, something like 1,500 workers, okay, here locally. I'm not sure it's all local, but anyway, they were going to lay off a bunch of workers. Well, who were those workers? Primarily, they were long-term employees of Lilly. They're experienced staff. And when they need to hire people back, they're not going to hire the experienced staff back. In fact, some of them they're going to replace immediately with new hires, people that haven't been in the industry, have not got a lot of experience. You see, what happens is that people have, and this gets into some of the things that we were talking about today in the discussion we're going to have with it, and that is that we think the only way to retain employees is to keep increasing the salary. And many industries do this. The computer industry, for example. Every year, everybody expects to get a 10% raise. And then when the economy tanks and they can't sustain themselves, they lay off in mass lots of experienced workers. Well, this isn't the first rodeo, people been through. My brother, for example, in the industry developing computer systems and actually chips, he went to his boss and he said, "Hey, don't raise my salary anymore. I've seen what happens. You get above this salary and you're primed to go. And so just I'm making plenty of money, just keep me at the same salary." And then when the economy tanked, he was one that didn't get laid off. And companies do this over and over again. And the brain drain is enormous. It doesn't fix everything to lay off your most experienced people, right? So some of these tactics, we need to understand what's going on and learn from the experience of others and say, you know what, maybe there's a better way here. Okay, so setting of group rates it can be explicit in the union and public sector. Groups get together and say, okay, well, let's categorize these people. People are individuals, so let's categorize them anyway, and let's say, okay, in this category, this is the wage range that we're going to pay. Okay? Okay, we have certain differentials. For example, oftentimes in the construction industry, a foreman will be offered how much more than the people they're managing? What's been your experience? Anyone know how much more they pay foremen? You ever talked about that in any of your internships? My experience.
Mine was about 20%.
20%. Was it?
15 to 20.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I've seen it about 10 in many places. 15 to 20 is high from what my experience is. But anyway, if you're really struggling to keep your foreman and you want to motivate people to learn how to be and take the responsibility in management to be a foreman, then you've got to pay them a premium. Okay? Usually as a percent of earnings. Okay, so employers may not be able to afford a pay increase. It may eliminate profits entirely. The wage increase may price a product or a service out of the market. On the other hand, it could be a negotiating tactic where you don't tell the truth, if you will, okay, about what your actual status is. I don't recommend that. I think it will come back and bite you. But you can't keep that kind of information out of the public sector, though you might try. And when it becomes visible, because they leak it, because other people think it's dishonest in your own company and they leak it, okay, you're going to lose integrity that may have taken years, even decades to develop. Okay, ability to pay actual wages depends on the employer's ability to raise revenues, ability to cut non-wage costs. Okay, if we're going to pay more for our labor and we can't increase what we're charging our clients, then we've got to get the savings somewhere. Are we going to pay less for concrete? Are we going to pay less for the equipment that we buy? Are we going to lose less of it because it doesn't walk off the job site? How are we going to pay for this? Okay? Okay, you got to ask yourselves, okay, what are you going to do? What would be done with the money if it's not used for wages? If the market has gone up and you can charge more, okay? Remember, we don't want to get into grievance, do we? We want to be proactive. We want to do the things that are going to make people active, actively say to their friends and their family, what am I? I'm not just a carpenter. I'm not just an engineer. I'm not just a project manager. I work for so-and-so construction company, or for so-and-so EPC, okay? Or so-and-so owner, whatever it is. You want them to tie their future together with yours so that they're highly motivated to do that. Okay, so, look at what you can do along the way and see, do as much as you can for your employees, and it will go a long ways. Okay, some compensation criteria. You can have a reactive process where basically, hey, we're losing a lot of guys. We keep losing people out of this position. So what are we doing wrong? Why do we keep losing them? That's sort of reactionary, isn't it? Okay, how do we keep from losing people? Okay, you could say, okay, we're going to go back and we're going